name is Will Gamache. I teach jazz and brass at Northern Virginia Community College. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the woodwind and brass instruments within kind of the jazz world, common ones within the jazz world. We're not going to start with this one. We're actually going to start with our woodwind instruments. We're going to start with the clarinet. And so the clarinet is a woodwind instrument because it has a reed on the end. This is a synthetic reed, but most reeds you'll see are wood reeds, which is why we call them woodwind instruments. So the clarinet's role in like early jazz, and it was really much more common in early jazz, like the late 19th century, early 1900s, up through like the 1930s. Clarinet was a really common part of like a Dixieland combo, which is one of those early jazz ensembles, and a little bit into the big band era. So the clarinet's role was sometimes a melodic role, sometimes kind of a soloist role, but also sometimes kind of like an ornamentation role, where it kind of would play like some higher lines that would either harmonize or dance around like the melodic line. I'm going to play a couple of notes on the clarinet, and I may very well squeak because I'm a reformed middle school band director, but I'm a brass person. So obviously clarinet can play a lot higher than that, but I'm not a clarinetist, and there's no need for me to play that high. But often you will hear clarinet kind of up there, playing some really high stuff, kind of above the melodic line. That's the clarinet. I don't think I need to subject you guys to any more of my clarinet playing because I'm a brass player. But we're going to talk about another very common woodwind within the jazz world. And this is a saxophone. It is not the saxophone. There are a number of common saxophones. This is the tenor saxophone. So the saxophone family, which were invented by a man named Adolph Sax, hence the name saxophone, were invented to kind of compete with brass instruments in terms of like volume. So you'll notice like the clarinet, unless you're playing very high, isn't incredibly loud. It can be, but it's kind of outclassed, I guess, a little bit by some of the louder brass instruments. And jazz often was kind of an outside art form in its early days. You'd get small jazz groups in bars and taverns and brothels sometimes, but also quite often outside on the street corner. And in New Orleans today still, you'll see a lot of jazz bands and kind of pickup brass bands playing on street corners. It's certainly an art form. But when you're playing outside, there are certain instruments that are kind of conducive to playing outside, and the clarinet isn't always one of them, but the saxophone sure is. So you'll notice this is made of metal. This is made of brass, just like brass instruments, but we still call it a woodwind because it has a reed. This reed is made of wood, hence the name woodwind. So anyway, here's my tenor saxophone playing. Anyway, that's a saxophone. The other common saxophones are the alto saxophone, which is a little bit smaller, and the baritone saxophone, which is a little bit bigger. There are others as well. There's the soprano saxophone, which is even smaller than that. The bass saxophone, which you don't see a lot, but that's bigger because it's a lower instrument. The tenor can play pretty low. This is what a lot of people when they think of the saxophone. But remember, there are a number of saxophones. This is not the only one. All right. So those are kind of our woodwind instruments that are incredibly common in the jazz world. There are always others. Any instrument can be a jazz instrument. We're going to talk about brass instruments now. This is the trumpet. The trumpet and earlier the cornet, which is just sort of a slightly shorter, mellower version of the trumpet. were incredibly common. A lot of early jazz musicians were either pianists or trumpet players, cornetists, because this instrument was incredibly common in the late 19th century, and so you'd almost be, I'm obviously kidding a little bit, but like walking down the street and be able to trip over a trumpet, because in the 19th century, during the Civil War and a little bit after that, brass bands were really common. So, which is essentially a bunch of cornets or trumpets, and then slightly larger and larger brass instruments, alto horns and tenor horns, which we're not going to talk about now, but they're just slightly larger, and then trombones, tubas. Those are brass instruments, right? And so there were a lot of cornets, and they were cheap and easy, easy to fix. They really don't come into a lot of pieces unless you really take them apart, and so very common. And so a lot of early jazz musicians learned to play the cornet, like Louis Armstrong and Buddy Bolden. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the trumpet or the cornet. This is a brass instrument, which means it has a mouthpiece like this, and you bud your lips to make sound into the mouthpiece, which then turns into a sound on the instrument. So, again, this instrument in the jazz world quite often carried the melody. So, anyway, so let's see. Louis Armstrong was obviously he was a famous trumpet player or cornet player, and when we're talking about Buddy Bolden, he was one of the really early pioneers of kind of this jazz style, and so I'm going to demonstrate kind of the accents that we're talking about, putting the emphasis, the accent on 2 and 4, and what I mean is this: instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, which sounds very kind of classical music, is more like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that was something that was really pretty revolutionary and was kind of one of the early elements of jazz style. So again, this is the trumpet. Often carries the melody within a jazz band. So there you go, that's the trumpet. We're going to move on to larger brass instruments. This next instrument is what I really play. This is the trombone. The larger you get, the lower the instrument, and the lower the pitch. So the trombone has something that none of these other instruments have, which is a slide. The slide moves to change notes, and that's how you get the wonderfully silly sound we call a gliss. It's kind of the trombone thing. Within early jazz, the trombone's role kind of accentuated the bass line, sometimes would be the bass line, and kind of did some kind of color tones like that and kind of supported the melody often. So, kind of Dixieland style trombone playing, had a lot of glisses, and they did a lot of kind of this downbeat, almost like effect playing. But trombone, as you kind of move ahead in the jazz world, becomes more of a melodic instrument sometimes, but certainly less of like less of almost like a toy, and more of like takes a more active role in the music. The last instrument I want to talk about in our woodwind and brass instruments common in the jazz world video is the tuba or sousaphone. The sousaphone specifically, which is kind of the marching band tuba, is this. I'm going to try not to hit my ceiling. So, the sousaphone is obviously quite large, and that means it's a low instrument. This is definitely a bass instrument. In early jazz, the role of a bass was often a tuba or sousaphone instead of a string bass, because again, when you're playing outside, this bell, which is where all the sound comes out, is going to project a lot better than plucking a string. And there wasn't any amplification really when jazz started as a genre in like the very late 19th century and early 20th century. The recording industry really was just about to kick off. So anyway, here we go. So I'm going to play a little blues scale for you and do what we call a walking bass line. There's your blues scale, and this is commonly what you the kind of the role that the sousaphone would play, the tuba would play. I'm using two words for this instrument because tuba is the concert instrument, but this is the one that often people will like see in their head. This is called a sousaphone. It's simply a marching tuba. It was invented for the Sousa band, the John Philip Sousa band, and so when they're marching, they needed something they could carry. So you wrap it around your shoulder, and you call it a sousaphone. All right. Anyway, there you go. You get a little bass line there, and that's kind of our woodwind and brass adventure video. Other common instruments within the jazz world that a lot more people are generally familiar with. You've got drums, either as a drum set, which is what we're familiar with now, or earlier it was like a snare drum and then a bass drum, and people would have one of those and like they'd kind of play together as a unit. Later, kind of at the tail end of like early jazz, I mean, you certainly get like banjo and guitar often, and those were kind of very much rhythmic instruments that would like play chords. Obviously now piano is much more common to do that either in addition or in place of like guitar, but pianos, if you were playing in like a bar or a brothel, it was easy to play piano if they had one. If they didn't have a piano, well, you needed something that was movable. So on like street corners and in Dixieland combos, piano wasn't as common because you just couldn't move it around. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. And yeah, cool, great. Happy Monday, and yeah, cool. Keep jazzing out there, everybody.